Hello and welcome to my video, where I'm going to show you how to recycle a Pringles tube into a secret safe. In other words, a place to hide a bit of cash. This is just a fun little project and I hope you enjoy it. In order to follow along, you will need a piece of paper, some aluminium foil, tape, polymer clay, a clay roller and clay cutter or a craft knife, an oven, a ceramic tile, some soft pastels if you have them, sandpaper, a pair of scissors, a Pringles tube, a jar or other container that just fits inside a Pringles tube, some strong all-purpose glue, a fine paintbrush, some mirror card, a pen or pencil, and something to texture the clay with, like an old toothbrush. First of all, did you know that a Pringles crisp is a hyperbolic paraboloid shape? If you didn't know, then you know now, and you need to make that shape in clay. Could I have just curved the clay around a simple tube or made a DIY mould out of foil? Sure, but instead I thought I would make a hyperbolic paraboloid out of paper and use that to form the clay mould. Apparently I've got a horrible habit of having to do things properly even for a clay crisp. And if you're the same way, then feel free to look at my previous video to find out how to make it. Otherwise, you can just use a cardboard tube or make an approximate shape of a Pringle using foil. If you do make the paper shape, you'll need to add tape to keep it in the form that you want it, and then you'll need to add a layer of foil on top and tape this in place as well. The first piece of foil will rip because of the shape, so just fill in the gaps with more foil and tape those pieces in place as well. Essentially, what we're trying to do here is make the top of the shape as smooth as possible. Otherwise, of course, the clay will just follow the shape of the paper folds. Next, you need to take a chunk of white polymer clay and condition it. To do this, warm it in your hands and continuously roll it into different shapes to make it more pliable. You'll know it's worked when the clay isn't cracking when you fold it. Then condition a small piece of yellow clay. Then take a tiny amount of the yellow and add it to the white. It's best to use too little than too much. Keep mixing the colours until you're happy with the result. Then roll out the clay on the ceramic tile. You want it to be thin, but not so thin that it will break easily when baked. 2 to 3 millimeters is ideal. I ended up thinning the clay out a final time with my fingers so I could feel when the right thickness was achieved. In order to know how large I needed this oval to be, I'd drawn around the base of the Pringles can onto paper. You want the crisp to be a little bit smaller than the inside of the tube. Then place the clay sheet onto the centre of the paper mould. Use a blade or craft knife to cut the shape you want and remove the excess clay. I also press down at the edges to thin and smooth them out. For texturing, you can use coarse sandpaper, which roughs up the surface a bit. You can use scrunched up foil, which creates pitting, or you can use an old toothbrush, which creates a fine stippling. When applying this texture, just dab the sandpaper or foil or brush on the surface. Don't drag it across the clay. I personally think the toothbrush creates the best effect. Next, I added some colour to the crisp. I used my cutting blade to scrape off some yellow-orange soft pastel, as well as a tiny bit of white and brown. Use a brush to mix the powder and sparingly apply the pastel to the surface of the clay. I just worked inwards from the edges and avoided the centre to create some dimension. Bake this clay in the oven following the instructions on your packet of clay. Please note that because this contains paper, make sure it goes nowhere near a heating element and that you don't exceed the recommended temperature. Also make sure that anything you use for clay is not used for food purposes as well, and don't cook food at the same time as the clay. After baking, air out your oven to get rid of the fumes. Once the clay crisp is completely cool, use some fine sandpaper to smooth the edges. Make sure you're using a breathing mask and ventilation. I then took my storage jar and drew around the lid onto the back of some mirror card. I cut out the circle and glued it onto the lid. In hindsight, I shouldn't have used the lid of the jar as the guide. I should have used the diameter of the inside of the Pringles tube instead. As a result, you'll see that the mirror card is a bit too small. Now, because only the edges of the clay contact the jar lid, it's a good idea to use the scrap clay from earlier to make a stand for the crisp, so it can be connected to the lid much more strongly. So shape the scrap clay into a block, press the crisp down onto the block to shape it, and then bake the block in the oven. Once the block is completely cool, glue it onto the lid, and then glue the crisp onto the top of the block. Make sure the crisp is centered, and then leave the glue to dry. To use this secret safe, just put your valuables into the jar, screw on the lid, and then carefully slide the jar to the bottom of the can. I was pleased with how this came out, but I definitely think it would look better with more crisps in the tube. I really hope you enjoyed this project, and thank you very much for watching.